This micro lecture is going to be on ideology and memoricide, tradition, traditions, and traditionalism. When we hear the word memoricide, most people initially don't know what it means, but it means essentially a loss of memory. We all know, for example, at a personal level, if we were to go to bed at night, put ourselves under the covers, wake up in the morning, we have no memory, it would be very, very difficult to orient. For memory, in many ways, is what allows us to find our way through a day, planning for a week. A sense of the past informs the present and guides us to some degree into the future. Now, when a culture has no memory or has been clear cut, it's understandable why people have the disorientation they have. And this feeds into what's seen as the rise of the political right in the culture wars. A lot of the political right, very more populist political right, is in search of a tradition, of a memory, of some way to navigate in an age in which they feel all the markings, all the cairns are lacking, have disappeared, have been destroyed. And so when it comes to human identity, making ethical choices, political choices, religious choices, there is no map anymore. And in that sense, the quest, the longing for some sort of orientation, some sort of compass to guide by, some sort of North Star, this goes a long way in explaining why people are looking for some sort of certainty, some sort of grounding under their feet. And so the lack of memory or memoricide, in fact, is generating part of the culture wars and the polarization that we live in at the present time. We hear often about the clear cutting of our forests and the appalling sight it presents to us when we look at it, but we also have clear cut our culture, our civilization, and then we can look across the landscape and the barrenness of it, and we see stumps standing around, but not much more that once revealed to a people, a culture, a civilization, a grandeur, a fullness that once existed. This is also part, I think, people's interest in First Nations. First Nations people have felt that the West has clear cut their culture, memoricide, and they're longing to get back to the stories, the myths, the history, the elders, all of these things. And so often the West is blamed for the clear cutting of First Nations or Aboriginal culture. But in fact, the West has also clear cut its own history. And this is important to understand. It's been a certain understanding of progressive liberalism that has led to the assimilation of First Nations. It also has deadened and demeaned the great history back of liberalism. And so memoricide, in that sense, goes in a variety of directions, but it has been very much shaped by a progressive notion of history, by which the past is something less significant, less enlightened, less meaningful than the forward march of history. It's what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, in that we who are further along in history have a deeper understanding of the meaningful issues of wisdom, insight, contemplative, justice, peacemaking, all these big perennial themes of the human journey. We might ask then, when people have no memory of the big things, the substantive things, what then do they do with their time? Well, some, of course, just amuse themselves through 1,000 diversions, distractions. Sports become a great allure. It's what Camus said, sports are so important because they're so unimportant, but they provide immense distractions for people from dealing with the bigger issues of what it means to be a thoughtful human being rather than culturally illiterate in terms of what that means. The Romans in their time talked about if we can just give people bread and circuses, they won't have to think. So give them their bread, feed them, give them jobs that pay them enough to keep them going from day to day. And when they've taken care of their physical needs, then they're distraction, they're circuses in that sense. And so when we demean the great issues, then people's souls shrink. As Rilke would say, we go in the smallest circle turns. in terms of what people turn to for meaning, remembering ideology is itself about meaning. The quest for meaning, when people do not live for the greater issues of meaning, inevitably they shrink to smaller issues of possessions and property and amusements of sports and 1,000 other things that a person can turn to when the big issues are gone. And so memoricide is about take away the big issues of memory, what do people then turn to? Now, so what might be some of the causes of memoricide in the West? What are some of the historic reasons? I want to just linger at two, and then I'll come back to the question of memoricide or the issue of clear cutting and the implications for culture, for people, for families, for ethnic groups, for politics, for religion, for media, for many of these issues. The first issue, which would be the nearest to us, obviously, is people like within the Enlightenment tradition itself, the Enlightenment tradition, particularly elements of the center and the right elements of the Enlightenment tradition, following Hegel, who we have touched on earlier, argue that history is a movement ever forward from a thesis to an antithesis to a synthesis to a new thesis. And so the march or the movement of history ever forward is a progress into a greater consciousness of freedom, of liberty. We find this in Marx as well, only he applies it to the economic sphere. For Hegel, it's applied more to a cultural, philosophical, religious sphere in which the Weltgeist or the world spirit moves civilizations and culture ever forward to a greater understanding of what consciousness of liberty is. Now, Hegel thought that, in fact, his time in history was the most enlightened. But what undergirds that sort of philosophical read of history is that the past is not as enlightened as we are. It doesn't have the depth, the insight. And as we move through history, in fact, we, surfing the wave of history, we understand things better. And this is part of the prejudices of liberalism in terms of its read of history, of progressivism as a dialectic movement forward. And so when we think of ideology and history, it's important that we ponder the notion that if we think of history as moving forward, then the past is of secondary or tertiary consequence, only perhaps as archival, worthy of archival research or museum or archaeological work, but no significance whatsoever for us in the present as we move into the future. Yeats saw this very clearly at his time when he said the center cannot hold mere anarchy. In one sense, has taken over the world. By anarchy, he very mentioned that sheer fragmentation is that people had no more markings anymore to live by. Hence, they went off in a variety of fragmentary directions in the search for meaning. And so you get people like Yeats sees very, very clearly where this is going. This moved him in a direction of Irish nationalism. And of course, various nationalist movements moved out of that, out history, as they very much participated in the notion that if history is ever moving forward, it cuts the roots off any cultural, historic, ethnic peoples. And what happens when that occurs? How do people orient anymore? How do they find meaning? What are the markings they have? And as I mentioned earlier, this is what leads to, in many ways, the turn to the populist right at the present time we're seeing, but certainly in the 20th century saw many movements of the ideological right turning to tradition as well, including various forms of Japanese nationalism, fascism, Nazism, and many, many other movements, in fact. And so what a certain form of liberal progressivism, in fact, creates its opposite intellectually, by which it's a breeding ground then for a certain turn to a tradition which has been clear-cut, in which there is. But the problem in this, of course, when people turn to tradition, then they often selectively pick elements of that tradition while ignoring substantive elements of that tradition. So it becomes usually a very narrow and selective read of a small t tradition in opposition to a big T tradition, which I'll come to in a few minutes. So if the Enlightenment project was significant of the 19th, 18th centuries, of seeing history as progress moving ever forward. And Hegel is very, very important in that in terms of the centrist wing of the Enlightenment and Marx of the leftist wing of the Enlightenment. There were certain thinkers also uh, in the Enlightenment, broadly speaking, that bought into that ideological read of the movement of history. The Enlightenment project, though, built on the back of which a key figure in this notion of history as progress, in which the past is largely unknown or forgotten or selectively retrieved, would be the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, basically in terms of the understanding of how they viewed the Roman Catholic churches, it was the problem. 1,500 years of church history, intellectual thought, theology, philosophy, politics, economics, culture, literature, architecture, art. This was tradition, and tradition was seen as a negative sense in the sense. So they had to get, so whether it's Luther or Calvin, Anabaptist, there was this jump back to the Bible as the source of authority. You get the same thing in the Renaissance of the 16th century. There's this interesting combination of the 16th century between the Reformation and the Renaissance, in which one goes back to the classical civilization of Greece and Rome. The elements of the Protestant Reformation went back to Bible, sola scriptura. The best of the reformers of the 16th century tried to bring together the humanist tradition of the Renaissance with the best of the Reformation. But what often occurred at this point, and of course history as it moved past that, the evangelical wing and others, is that all people had to know was the Bible. And so the 1,500 years that had been very, very much a part of the Western tradition were largely forgotten. And as long as a person turned to the Bible, of course, the question is whose interpretation of the Bible, then the result of this is that 1,500 years of culture, of civilization disappears. And we can see how then the Enlightenment project builds on the protesting tendencies of the Reformation, and the Enlightenment itself is a protesting movement against the Protestant Reformation itself. And so this notion is that history is moving forward in terms of the Enlightenment. The Protestants were more enlightened than the Catholics. They were returning to the greatness of the biblical tradition. The Renaissance, to some degree, saw the 1,500 years of Western Eastern history as problematic. They turned to the Greeks and the Romans. So this way of thinking, which is very ideologically loaded in terms of how history is read, meant that significant and substantive elements of culture and civilization disappeared, dissipated, and then the Enlightenment, building on the Reformation, took the position that history is moving forward, and so the past in that sense is not quite as significant. Now, when we hear the word tradition in memoricide, when most people think tradition, they see something as dead and formal, and they're probably confusing tradition with traditionalism. Tradition in the big T sense is the complex dialogical engagement of which a civilization or culture looks at the big issues of metaphysics and religion and theology and philosophy and politics and economics and culture and arts and humanities, and tries to make sense of what is the best, the noblest element when embodied, thought through, that guides a civilization forward, recognizing there are different perspectives, but it takes place within the framework of a civilization. A tradition, a small t tradition, takes one element of a great tradition and shrinks the great tradition in that sense. Traditionalism are those who come from a particular small t tradition but don't ask critical questions about it anymore. So the Enlightenment tradition, capital T, has a variety of wings to it. There's the right wing of the Enlightenment, there's the centrist wing or the humanist wing, and there's the romantic wing. So there's the rationalist, the humanist, and the romantic. Some people, when they think of the Enlightenment project, only think of the scientific, rationalist, empirical, inductive, deductive. But there's also the romantic, which is about myth, it's about narrative and intuition. The humanist wing of the Enlightenment brings together the best of these three small t traditions and attempts to propose a way forward. What they all tend to share, though, is this sense that history is moving forward, even though certain romantic wings of the Enlightenment they saw the problem that was occurring with this chronological snobbery, and they tried to very much articulate an organic connection between the past, the present, and the future, and community and history, whereas the center and center-right tended a little more to see history as progress. So memoricide, clear-cutting of culture. Important to understand, though, the difference between the Great T tradition, even within, say, the Protestant Reformation. You have three small T traditions emerging in the 16th century. You have Lutheranism, you have Calvin, you have the Anabaptists, well, you also had the Baptists, the Quakers, the Roman Catholic. So the capital T tradition, in a large sense, is a forum in which some of the most important ideas are thought through. Now, when we come to many people today, because they're not given any sense of where they have come from, where their own people have come from, where a civilization has come from, where a culture has come from, then they have no idea. There's nothing going on between the ears in terms of the great writers and the thinkers that have preceded us. I mean, historically, people have said if we see further than those who have gone before us, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Most people don't know the giants' shoulders they are on anymore because they don't even know there's giants there. So most people today who come to university, how well do they know their Plato, their Aristotle, their Seneca, their Aeschylus, their Augustine, the Bible, Ambrose, Gregory, Aquinas, Macrina, Hildegard, or from Indian tradition, the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, or the great classics of Japanese civilization, or Africa, or the Middle East. These are all gone. There's no memory of anything. So then, as I mentioned earlier, people tend to shrink to very small understandings of what's worth living for. And so it becomes just going round and round with a series of relatively irrelevant issues, and people then can become very animated and scrap and fight and butt horns about things that are quite insignificant when it comes to the substantive issues of life. But when people have not been trained, when their souls and imaginations and hearts and heads have not been lifted to greater sights worth seeing and living for, then their minds and imaginations shrink to the smallest circle turns, and there's implications of that for that what people then live for, and then what they don't live for. I might also argue secularism, in its engagement with religion, is itself a tradition. And so the very idea that somehow tradition is something dead, people are usually confusing a capital T tradition with traditionalism. Everyone comes from a tradition, even though people who say, I'm not traditional, that itself is a tradition. There's no way of escaping tradition. Tradition is just a way of seeing, interpreting reality, trying to make sense of it, both in thought, life, and deed. And so to the degree when we think ideology and politics, the key thing here is each person needs to ask themselves, what tradition do I come from? Is it a small t tradition? Is it just simply traditionalism? Or what are the possibilities of, in fact, seeing the great mountains, the K2s, the Everests, the Bakers of the great T tradition? And then where does each person find themselves on that mountain? Are they just living in a little wee acreage on the mountain, confusing the acreage for the great mountain? Often what happens with most people when they try and begin to think reflectively on where they have come from, why they think what they do, they often are very much shaped, formed, socialized, enculturated in that sense. From a little acreage they grew up, their particular peer groups, their families, their history. The task of thinking in tradition, and this is where memory is important to give back, contra memoricide, is looking at the big mountain of historic thought, of philosophy, theology, politics, culture, literature, the arts, all of these things. And this is what a capital T tradition is. It offers people the gift of the great mountain range of human endeavor and thought, and it saves people from shrinking to a little acreage, which they call reality, and they live, move, and have their being with. And so ideology and memoricide, how have we got to the point in which there is clear cutting of our intellectual heritage? Where has that come from? Are there ways of overcoming that in terms of giving people back a wide range, a mountain range of thinking, by which then wisdom, insight, contemplation, all of these issues then can inform what it means to be human, to live in society, to live in community, to engage politics at an economic, cultural, religious, educational way, and move forward as a people. So ideology has played a very significant role in undermining memory, and there's serious implications when people lack memory in terms of knowing how to negotiate their way individually, as families, as friends, as communities, as a culture forward. And so something to ponder. Ideology, memoricide, big T tradition gives people the opportunity from a variety of cultures, whether it's, as I mentioned earlier, Middle Eastern, African, Western, Latin American. These all have great heritages. And so the world of comparative recalling memory is very important in terms of being a cosmopolitan citizen in which we hear, we understand how civilizations of the past have thought through at a more in-depth way what it means to live together, to move forward, and then the implications of that when memory itself is dissipated and memoricide, the ideology of memoricide dominates, and the implications of that.